The feature freeze is next Tuesday. If anyone has a PR that is due 417 but will not make this, please let me know so we can discuss it now. I've spent the last week working on the XDS-based Istio commands for version and proxy status, and I got frustrated with the large number of command line options for them, and I decided to implement a customer request a config file for Istio. So I would like now to walk everyone through what I implemented so we can see if this is what is needed and the right solution for it. So before 1.7, we picked up a lot of important things from the Kubernetes config file, such as the current context and the, which of course gives us where the control plane is located. Most of the stuff that we needed was there, but if we don't have Kubernetes in the picture, if we have just a control plane out there on the internet somewhere, we won't have that. So I wanted to make sure that we had a replacement for that. So I designed a config file for the settings. The goals were that it should be very familiar. Our users' commands shouldn't change. The new required parameters should just sort of be there. And other flags are also going to just be there. It should be easy for someone who's used kubectl to set those defaults. It should be easy to override those defaults, and it should be easy to implement because the code freezes soon, and I actually want this in. So I propose that there be a config file located at .istioctl similar to what you see with .kube.yaml for Kubernetes. I want the user experience to be nearly the same. So this is how the proxy status command should be. The current command doesn't require parameters, but when I was testing this, there were a lot of parameters that were needed. I kept having to put the XDS address, the cert directory in, and I would often get those wrong. It was difficult, so I wanted them all to be defaultable. I wanted this to work with other things that users commonly do. I know people can customize the Istio namespace, and these people have complained about how Istio doesn't pick up that customization. We could also consider, but I didn't do the kube context if we wanted. With Kubernetes, people often keep multiple config files around, and they use kubeconfig to point to them. So I put the same functionality in. So it should be able to point to one configuration file and do proxy status against one control plane instance. You should be able to do the same thing with another status against another instance. And if you didn't want to use a config file, I took advantage of the Viper feature, allowing any of those parameters to be environment variables. So let's say your Istio namespace was called not Istio system. You would just do this, and from then on it would default for the rest of the work that you were doing. I also found that I looked at the documentation and didn't want to write pages and pages telling people to do Istio experimental version, Istio experimental proxy status. We don't really want to replace the commands that are there right now because these new XDS ones are kind of only alpha level in my opinion. But explaining that is too difficult, especially in 1.8, they might become the standard. So I have an additional setting called prefer experimental. And if a user sets that, the experimental commands appear instead of the current 1.6 implementations. All good so far?
Yep.
So let me show you what the config file looks like. It's just a YAML file. Here's a sample one that I'll like to put into Istio's samples that it ships with. Sort of gives some examples of things you can set, such as the XDR address. We can talk about what this should look like, but here's some of the things that I have set it for in the past. Just commented out example of how to set the namespace and the cert directory. Since I wrote this document, I've added a few other settings, but this is basically it. I've also added a config list command that will show you the values that are going to be picked up from Istio defaults and this list sort of combined. I'll give you a demo of that in a moment. Liam had asked for there to be a set command to set these defaults, but I didn't implement that because the stuff in Viper for setting piece parameters was blowing away all the comments. And the comments were almost more useful than being able to set it. I could be wrong about that. I actually have the change, but it's not in the PR that I'm trying to get merged. So I will, and the implementation says Viper and it's small. So I'd like to give a demo of it now. So if I do config list, I see the values of the things that I have set. The Istio namespace that we all know, and a bunch of parameters for central Istio D. And currently I have no Istio config. And if I do Istio Cuddle X version, it will go out to the control plane and use these settings. So when you don't set XDS address, but use the default XDS port, it uses Kubernetes to find Istio D, but it will be passing in these certificates. So it's really going to use the secure 1512 port, but it will pass in these certificates. If these were invalid, it wouldn't work. You can see that it sort of gives the version here. If I set it to a different thing, so now I've given it the insecure configuration. I do config list to show you that. It's now going to use 1510. It doesn't have certs. And I do version, same as we saw before. The implementation is the same. Ignore this because it's not part of the PR. And we can see that this stuff is all happening and it used these values. We can also set it to my test one localhost, which is what I use when I'm running Istio D locally on my laptop, or if I'm port for settings there. And if I do the command.
And when you have both address and port specified, is there a precedence in those?
There is, I'm not super happy with the fact that port appears here because it is not in the config file. That is the default for that setting. So it might be that we need to get rid of it. I sort of, it's unclear what this value should be. And my first version was just to put the sort of defaults in. And the default for port is 1512, and it does take precedence if the user sets this. So I did.
So the order of precedence then would be first the default, then a user specified XDS address, and then a user specified XDS port? Or what happens if the user specifies both of those in their config file?
I believe that if the user specifies both XDS address and port, that it should complain. But I can check that right now. So I don't currently have pilot running, so it sort of gives me this error, connection refused. If I was to do XDS address localhost 1510, XDS port 1234, it is sort of ignoring this silently, which may not be the correct behavior. So let me write that down. That's a long-standing thing.
I think maybe on the config list command, it would be good to put defaults in brackets so that it's clear that it's not set and will not apply in terms of precedence.
You have a good point. I might make this only show overridings. It's
I really like the idea of showing the defaults. It just, we need to call them out as defaults. If
right.
that makes sense.
It sort of picks it up from this default here. So, and some of the settings I didn't put in. If you look at the PR, you can see that the list of things that are there is explicit as part of the PR, and the code has to do it. So something like the timeout, I didn't put in because I've never used it. It's easy to add and remove them. That's basically the demo. Any questions about this work? So my question is, I made it as a,
Really cool. I had no idea you were working on this. I like it.
thank you. I made it a green document here, but I could, if you guys approved it, I could make it, I could go back and make it blue and you could approve it again and we could ship it. And the PR is really small. If we look at it, it turned out Istio already uses Viper, and Viper is already extremely powerful and not full of garbage. So it says it's large, but it's not really that big. Most of the largeness is that new configuration command. The actual handling for the things like the defaults for Istio namespace is just putting viper.getString into the places where the defaults were in istioctl in the flags. So it's really simple. I had hoped to show the demo using proxy status instead of version, but then I made some changes and didn't have a sort of combined one. But there's this proxy status command. Let me show you it. This is the new proxy status command. The output of the new proxy status command is exactly the same as the output for the old proxy status command. Identical, maybe except for the version, and that's not my fault. Because the place that this version gets coughed up is slightly different. But when a release is made and it's not a daily build, it will be different. So the implementation is the same. The client code is very similar, except that it's a whole XDS mechanism that we developed for the version command. I hope that people can look at that PR and just merge it. Thank you for the comments that you made, especially on that PR, Mitch. I did pretty much everything you said except for reporting an error to the user if their pod doesn't exist. So with the existing proxy status command, if I ask for the details of a particular pod, like details, this is the old proxy status. It says they all match. The new one will work the same. If I passed an invalid value to why didn't it work? It probably didn't work because I didn't give it a config file. Yeah, the old code would give it like a 400 or 404 if the request to pilot was malformed. There's no way to do that with the current extension stuff that is there, and fixing that turned out to be a huge bear. So I'm going to tell networking it's their job to fix when I talk to them on Thursday. So I hope that we can sort of make the PR for that sort of just go. If anyone wants to.
And is the only error condition a malformed proxy name?
So there's two error conditions. One is a malformed or missing proxy name. The other is a proxy name that doesn't exist, which should be like a 404. That never actually occurs because the client doesn't always goes to Envoy first to pick up the Envoy config. And if there's no such pod, it fails. So it's actually hard to test for invalid pods. But if you use gRPC curl to test it, it just returns nothing. It'd be so much better if it returned nothing and 404. But it's a main interface, and it would require me changing a bunch of Costins code to return a second parameter, and there's no way I'm touching that this week.
Yeah, that's fine. Can we just make sure that we're tracking these things that are lacking from networking and make sure that they end up as a P0 on the networking roadmap for 1.8?
That makes sense. Should we track it as an issue first, or should we go to the work group and meetings and beg them to tell us what to do? Maybe we should make it first and assign it to them.
Yeah, I think an issue, and then just as we start talking about roadmap, we'll make sure that they are aware of it and that it gets put on their roadmap. As far as I can tell, the main way that we're tracking work against a release is with that roadmap and with the weekly status meeting with work group leads. So that seems like the mechanism we should be using.
Okay, we'll do.
Thanks, Ed.
While I'm showing all this great stuff, I wanted to show the PR for more output columns. So with changes in how Pilot generates data for Envoy, and even before that, the output of the proxy config command was really poor when it comes as a list. This does not help anyone, the current output. I have a PR that makes the output look like this. This is how it looks on an Ingress, at least on my Ingress. So it adds mini columns here. It adds the domains that are being listened to, the particular matches, and if something has more than one match, it sort of shows. And if there's a virtual service involved, it shows which one. If a user does this on a pod in the mesh, they see the same stuff. Of course, it gets much messier because these names are so long, and I didn't want to try to make them smaller. But, and the matches, of course, usually are everything, but sometimes they're big. And the virtual service is here. And also destination rules has a similar thing that I put into, which command was it? So I added to the clusters subcommand the destination rule. And you can see a new column. That's all for that one. So anyway, I had gotten a bunch of feedback from people, and it looks like it may have passed a review. I just want to make sure everybody knows what's going on because it has not yet merged. So that's what I have. Mitch, I can show that your proposal now, or would you like to take over the screen sharing?
No, you can go ahead and open it up. There's only a handful of improvements from what we discussed last week. They are at the bottom. So 2 weeks ago, there were some performance concerns raised for the CSDS API based on the fact that it allows multiple config dumps to be collected simultaneously. I've spun up a testing cluster in the isotope or in the mixologist repository, which is where we run all of our Istio performance tests. I use the same script that the perf testing group uses to set up the cluster and to put the cluster under load. For reference, it's a service graph that includes 20 services per namespace. And I don't recall what the actual data plane load is, although data plane load is a little bit irrelevant to the conversation. What's particularly interesting is that every namespace has a config changer that is issuing a config change at a rate of, I believe, 1 per second. So with like at the top, when I scaled up to 25 namespaces, that means 500 proxies and 50 changes per second in config that are having to get pushed out to those proxies. So pretty heavy load. You can see Grafana snapshots throughout showing the impact on CPU, on config distribution time, memory, go routines of running. Most of the experiments I ran one config dump, then 5 config dumps, and then 50 config dumps. And no matter how I loaded down the IstioD instance, by the way, only one instance of IstioD serving all of that traffic, or not traffic, but serving all of that config to all of the proxies. We were not able to find any impact on CPU utilization or proxy distribution time. The one like caveat is if you remove sidecars so that there's 200 proxies with no sidecars, so all of them have full visibility to all of the other proxies. There was a spike in CPU, but it was commensurate with other spikes that were seen when not running the command. So it's a little bit difficult to say if the spike came from running the config dump command or if the spike came just from regular processes inside SDOD. The spike was not higher or more longer in duration than other spikes observed over the previous 2 hours. And that's the last link in the doc there if you want to look over those charts. Yeah, so where you see my blue stripes on the CPU panel, you do see some CPU spikes there, but as you can see, they're not outliers. And those are the only 3 times I ran the proxy config command on this particular cluster. So those other spikes represent just normal operations within SDOD itself.
Okay. Do you think this will convince networking that this is a valid way to do it?
I'm not especially optimistic that networking is able to be convinced. However, I think that we've done our due diligence now. We can take this and show that we're not irresponsibly creating a new performance hole. The only remaining section is just, well, the other thing is we've already agreed with networking not to implement this in 1.7. So if we were to move forward with it, it would go into 1.8.
Okay. Well, as you know, I like this better than the way that I did proxy status because this means that we'll be able to use other tools other than IstioCuddle, which has this unique debug way to do it.
Envoy Tools repo has a PR at the moment. I know, Ed, I sent this to you, but they're going to be publishing their own tooling as a client to the CSDS service, so that for any Envoy XDS server, you can take one generic tool and point it out there and get this sort of status and config dump information. So I've also been working with them on that PR and making sure that it's useful. My intent being that it should be useful against Istio in the near future.
Right. So if they do that, we can get out of the business of having IstioCuddle proxy status, and we could tell people to use theirs.
We could, if theirs becomes as good as ours. There might be a question of packaging. It's a little bit useful to download one tool and have all of the commands available, but maybe we import their tool and simply run their command under the hood or something along those lines. One way or another, a higher degree of API compatibility with standard Envoy tooling is going to benefit us.
Does anyone hear Mitch? I do not hear him.
Oh, sorry. I think I just stopped talking, Ed.
Oh, okay. So this is good. So in 1.7, we're going to do this stopgap, which is to have our own debug XDS stuff, but it returns CSDS responses. So it's an ad hoc request, a sort of standard response. And then if networking likes this, we will do a complete Envoy style request response, and then we can get rid of our ad hoc requests. So thank you for doing this work. Are you going to be presenting this to networking soon?
I have sent this to Costin individually because I think he's the only person who had concerns. I don't think it was collectively networking. So he's aware of the work. That's about as much as I can say about it.
Okay. Well, thank you for these tests.
Yeah, thank you. So are there any outstanding concerns about CSDS for 1.8 that I should be working on? Okay.
I have no concerns about it. I think um, have you run Envoy's tool?
I have not. It's still in pull request form, so I'd have to pull it down and build it myself, and I've been too lazy.
Okay, because I would be curious to see how their tool, what its output looks like.
Yes. So
So,
looking at it today, the tool's built by an intern at Google. Well, or at least the particular command of the tool is. And today it is very particular to Google Cloud's implementation of Traffic Director. They've already confirmed that they're open to pull requests. The thing that would differentiate from like Traffic Director to Istio to maybe an IBM implementation of XDS service or somewhere else is that the authentication. Each of us supports, slightly different authentication schemes, and provisioning your certificate material, things like that, are a little bit different per platform. So once we have a good story around how we get credentials provisioned for Istio in 1.8, which may be what we do in 1.7, I can modify their tool to be compatible with what we're doing.
okay. Well, thank you. I hope you can come back in maybe 2 weeks and show us just their output against an Istio cluster and compare it to ours. Maybe there's fields they have that we lack that would be valuable. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I'll take that as a follow-up as soon as I've got my service up and running. I think Ed, I've shown you the code. It's not there yet. It's not ready to be merged, which is fine because master isn't on 1.8 yet. The earliest it could merge is Wednesday. But yeah, within a week or two, it should be there. It's just a few rough edges here and there.
Okay, excellent.
Would it be, should I consider that design approved and move forward with this, or?
So from a user experience point of view, I of course approve it, but I'm only approving it from the user interface point of view. Costin's objections were not about the interface, but about the committing to something that might be heavy in terms of network or CPU.
Yeah,
So I can't approve it in terms of that.
that's fair. Yeah, I will address those concerns with Costin.
Okay. So that's the material that we have. Are there any other items that we want to talk about today? Also, I noticed Ram has joined us. Ram, were you here at the beginning when I gave the demo of config files for Istio?
No, I joined about like 25 minutes late.
Oh, because I should have called you to show it to you, but I'll give you the recording. I think that it's going to help a great deal with the user experience, especially around Central STOD.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely watch the recording.
Okay.
And I saw uh, the comment about additional columns. It satisfies all the original requests that I had, so I'm good with that.
Thank you, Ram. Ram, you had one other request, which was to restore some functionality to Istio Describe. I'll be asking the networking folks about that at the networking meeting because I've been frustrated with that as well. I wanted to bring up one more thing for everyone. So this is our favorite tool, XenHub. Let's pull up just the XenHub for user experience and 1.7. So these are the items that our group is either fully or partly concerned with for 1.7, which has our freeze in a week. Mitch, this is yours, right? The perf test?
Distribution status. That became irrelevant because we're not moving distribution status to. Sorry, I haven't cleaned that. That's 1.8.
Let me retarget it then. Oops. I clicked the wrong thing. I didn't retarget. There we go. So we are not fully on the hook for this tool to detect and warn about mixer usage. Everybody's doing it. I wanted to add this to Istio Analyze. I tried to do it this weekend, couldn't figure it out because I can't tell which Istio resources are the ones that are going away and which ones are staying. If anyone is working on that, let me know. Our big P0 is this central Istio stuff. I want to give everyone a brief update on the status of that. So we had promised to be able to sort of detect what the Istio is for the mesh. We were unable to get that to happen due to disagreements about how pods should be labeled for remote Istio. We were able to get security in when we talked directly, but the mechanism for creating the certificates is still out of band, and it looks like we're not going to have any other mechanism for 1.8. I'm trying to talk to the VM people. We might be waiting until 1.8 for making these certs. It might be that if you want to use Istio against remote Istio, you get the certs from your cloud provider. Mitch, do you have any thoughts on if Istio wait is going to be possible for 1.7 against central Istio?
No, it will not.
All right, so we'll update this and say this item will slip. If you are on central Istio, it'll still work if your Istio is local. We have decided to move anything Mitch was doing with regards to CSDS. And for 1.7, we're going to focus on my almost CSDS. Version is working and describe is working, although the improvements we wanted aren't going to be there. That's the thing I mentioned I'm going to be talking about with networking. Code we had in 1.4 that would sort of say what clients are using versus what authentication is required by pods. So I have no experience with the dashboard. Hopefully telemetry is going to handle that. If anyone's working on it, let me know. The multiple control plane, Ostermart tells me he might get that done. I told Shweta at the workgroup stage we're not going to get it done. I don't know what this one is. No visibility into bad IOP YAML. I think this is another thing about validating operators, and it's mostly environments. So the P1 is the thing I talked about, how we're going to use, how you're going to get the certificates you need for central Istio. The control plane update we talk about. In pretty good shape for our P1s. None of these that we see here are just us. This one has no one working on it. Let me ask Doug. So I guess that's the good news. There's not really any P1s that our team is responsible for. If anyone's doing P2s and needs a hand to get them done, let me know. And there seem to be some greater than P2s, not very many. They don't seem very important. Is that match what everyone's experience is?
Yep.
Okay, well, I believe this concludes our meeting. So next week is Code Freeze. Feel free to reach out at any time if you are working on something that is for that. As soon as the code is frozen, I'm going to pivot back to writing these tests, documentation-based tests, which I have been behind on. Hopefully we can get some more automated testing to make our testing days easier.
Thanks, Ed.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.